Welcome to the National Archives Know Your Records program. My name is Andrea Bassing-Matney. We are broadcasting live from the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. We're so pleased that you've joined us today. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few things with you. For those of you who are here with us on site, there are several handouts. Hopefully you've picked those up. And if you have any questions, I ask that you hold those until the very end of the program. And when you do have those questions at the end, if you could please use the microphones on the aisles. For those of you who are watching online, we have those same handouts available. If you go below the video screen on this YouTube page, you will see a hyperlink to the presentation slides. You will also find a hyperlink to captioning. So if you would like to see the words written out, please follow that link. So today we are pleased to have Damani Davis offer the presentation entitled Freedmen's Bureau Records for Family and Historical Research. Mr. Davis is a reference archivist at the National Archives Research Services Division in Washington, D.C. Since 2005, he has lectured at local, regional, and national genealogical conferences with a focus on the African American presence in federal records. He has published articles in the National Archives magazine, Prologue, highlighting African American participation in the Revolutionary War, migration and search for land ownership in the post-Reconstruction era, slavery, emancipation in Washington, D.C., and early 20th century federal citizenship records of blacks from the British West Indies. A native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and a veteran of the Gulf War, Mr. Davis pursued his undergraduate studies at Coppin State University in Baltimore, Maryland, where in 1998 he received a BA in history. He further pursued his studies in the Ohio State University, where in 2001 he received an MA in history. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Damani Davis.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Archives. Last week here at the National Archives, we celebrated or commemorated the 150th anniversary of the Freedmen's Bank. But that same day, March 3rd, was also the 150th anniversary of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was an institution that grew out of the activities of the Union Army in the post-Civil War South. Due to some of the same problems that the Union troops were faced with during and after the war, within the states of the former Confederacy primarily, the Freedmen's Bureau kind of consolidated a lot of those activities. During the aftermath of, or during the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War, the Union troops were dealing with, contraband or, formerly enslaved persons who were joining or following the U.S. troops in order to attain protection and, other services. In the aftermath of the war, there was a situation in which, many of the lands that were formerly owned by planters or plantation owners have been confiscated. There was also the situation that's, the norm in any post-war society in which there were many refugees, there were many displaced people. And from that, the Freedmen's Bureau gets its name. Is the official name is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Okay, so here we have an organizational chart. This schematic was actually, I think the credit for this diagram goes to my one of my former colleagues, Reginald Washington. This shows how the Freedmen's Bureau was organized. The headquarters was here in Washington, D.C., which was the office of the commissioner. Under that particular office, there were, staff officers, On the state level, there were assistant commissioners, or each state had its own assistant commissioner. And under each assistant commissioner in a particular state, there were sub-assistant commissioners and the sub-assistant commissioners had jurisdiction over particular field offices. Each field office was based in a city or town within a particular state and sometimes had jurisdiction over that town and surrounding counties. But using our descriptive pamphlets for each particular state, each particular Freedmen's Bureau assistant commissioner office on the state level, you can get a description of each of the field offices. The description shows the county jurisdiction of each field office, the name of the sub-assistant commissioner, and so forth. Okay. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau itself, what exactly was the Freedmen's Bureau? The Freedmen's Bureau had numerous responsibilities that most historians now consider to be far beyond any of the resources in manpower or financial resources that they ever received. One of the more recent histories of Reconstruction, Eric Foner's Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution from 1863 to 1877, he kind of gives a real good description of the major tasks facing the officers and agents of the Freedmen's Bureau. He says, describing the Freedmen's Bureau, its responsibilities can only be described as daunting. They included introducing a workable system of free labor in the South, establishing schools for freedmen, providing aid to the destitute, aged, ill, and insane, adjudicating disputes among blacks and between the races, and attempting to secure for blacks and white unionists equal justice from state and local governments established during presidential Reconstruction. Speaking about the agents of the Bureau, he described them as individuals who were in turn diplomats, marriage counselors. They had to be educators, supervisors of land contracts. They had to be the sheriff, judge, jury. The local bureau agent was expected to win the confidence of blacks and whites alike in a situation where race and labor relations had been poisoned by mutual distrust and conflicting interests. And he also quotes a General William Tecumseh Sherman's advice, or a comment he made to Oliver Otis Howard, saying that it is not in your power to fulfill one-tenth of the expectations of those who framed the Bureau. I fear you have a Hercules task. That kind of goes towards some of the major duties facing the Freedmen's Bureau. But as far as the legacy from a historical basis, you can also turn to W.E.B. Du Bois's assessment from 1935 in his book, Black Reconstruction in America from 1860 to 1880. Describing some of the positive legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau, he says, the Freedmen's Bureau was the most extraordinary and far-reaching institution of social uplift that America has ever attempted. Nearly all the present Negro universities and colleges like Howard, Fisk, and Atlanta were founded or substantially aided in their earliest days by the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau did an extraordinary piece of work, but it was but a small and imperfect part of what it might have done if it had been made a permanent institution and given ample funds for operating schools and purchasing land, and if it had been manned by trained civilian administrators. Basically, that last part highlights the fact that, the Freedmen's Bureau didn't have, even though it was tasked with all of these momentous duties, most of the men and the agents within the Freedmen's Bureau were military men. They were men who had just, served within the Union forces during the Civil War. These weren't, in today's terms, social workers and marriage counselors and, policemen and so forth, or, members of, the court system. But those were the types of duties that they had to address. Now, for our purposes, because of the work that the Freedmen's Bureau did during that small period of time, many of the records that were accumulated in their activities are very valuable from, of course, a historical perspective, when you're studying the Civil War era and Reconstruction. But for many of our patrons who come here to the National Archives, the records are very important from a genealogical perspective. The Freedmen's Bureau records here are reproduced on microfilm. Here we have on this slide some of the field offices in some of the states along with their microfilm publication numbers. All of the states of the former Confederacy, including border states such as Maryland and Delaware, and the District of Columbia, had field offices. We also have records of assistant commissioners in some of the states. Alabama, Arkansas, the District of Columbia, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, the Carolinas, Texas, and Virginia. The types of information you can find in Freedmen's Bureau records that have genealogical value include registers of employees, students, and patients, names, residences, and occupations of individuals who were formerly enslaved, names of former slave owners, marriage records, transportation records, freedmen disputes and complaints, list of destitute freedmen and their families, list of abandoned and confiscated property, labor and apprenticeship agreements and contracts, outrages and reports, claims for back pay, bounty payments, and pensions. Now, although these records have great genealogical value, the downside in these records is, although they're very voluminous and there's much valuable information in these records, they're very difficult to research. At this time, there's no comprehensive name or subject index for the Freedmen's Bureau records. The only way you can really research these records at this time is by going to the particular field office that may have had jurisdiction over the location or the county or town where you may have had an ancestor, getting a particular microfilm roll appropriate for that field office and just scrolling through the microfilm. I have heard rumors of various institutions attempting to create a comprehensive index, but it doesn't exist at this time, and I have no knowledge of the status of any of those efforts. I think the state or the library system of Virginia, the archives and system in Virginia is attempting, they're currently digitizing and indexing that state's Freedmen's Bureau records. But there's no comprehensive index for these particular records. Now let's see some of the records and just have a basic demonstration of what you can find. Here's a register from Davis Bend, Mississippi. Here it just has the names of individuals, freedmen, freed people, who are living at this particular location. It gives their sex, their ages, color, and their occupation at this time. So for genealogical purposes, that can be valuable if you have an ancestor who is named on this list and you as a descendant can identify that ancestor. Some of this information can be valuable. There are medical records. Again, the Freedmen's Bureau was oftentimes the only standing institution within the post-war South. So they were often the only source of medical attention in many of these areas. This is a medical register of patients in Augusta, Georgia. It gives the name of each individual, their age, sex, the date that they entered, and when the person was discharged. So if you have an ancestor who was a patient at some point, the person could potentially be found on a medical register. Here's a register of indentured colored orphans in Mississippi. Again, it gives some of the same information, gives the person's name, age, residence at the time, what particular county the person was in, and so forth. Here's an Arkansas Register of Employees and Employers. Again, the Freedmen's Bureau during this time was brokering a lot of the labor contracts between the freed people and landowners during this time. That was a very difficult process initially because you had three different points of views. You had the freed people, the formerly enslaved, who from their perspective, they felt that to truly be free, to truly enjoy their freedom, they needed land. So they desired their own land more than anything. William Tecumseh Sherman issued Special Field Order 15 in Georgia, where where we get the idea of the 40 acres and the mule, where he proposed that all of the land from Charleston to around Jacksonville in Florida be set aside for the formerly enslaved persons who had worked that land for at that point a couple of centuries. From the perspective that they deserved that land, the former owners had rebelled against the federal government. Therefore, since that land has been confiscated, that seemed to be a good idea. And many of the freedmen responded to that idea. But as we know from history, that special order was later rescinded by Andrew Johnson. And the whole idea of 40 acres in a mule and the desire for these formerly enslaved persons to get land was not something that was given. The Freedmen's Bureau agents desired to establish some type of labor system in the South, where there was a wage system, moved the South from the formerly, the system formerly based on, slavery, to one in which the formerly enslaved persons could be workers, working the land, making wages, and join the North as a place where wage labor prevails. And then you had many of the former Confederates who wanted to hold on to the prior system as much as they could, So you have these conflicting interests at the time. The labor contracts is what's going to be established. Many of these records highlight that. And actually, this system that's being established during this time is going to evolve into what became kind of the sharecropping system later going into the 20th century. Freedmen's Bureau also was highly involved in education. For some of these records, you can get records on superintendents of education for some of the states. Alabama, Arkansas, Washington, D.C., Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas and Virginia have records of the superintendents of education. Okay. Here's an example of some records associated with education. This is a school register and index from Arkansas. Gives the names of the children in the school, and some may be adults. Well, most of them are children, and it gives their ages, 16, 13, 9. I think one person is 20 years old. And it gives an index to the register. Okay. Here's within the Freedmen's Bureau records that I was investigating, is a letter from an AME pastor, Charles Bradwell, who's requesting assistance with the school, showing some of the local endeavors, some of the local efforts to, establish schools with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau agents. This says, Reverend Charles S. Bradwell, pastor of the African Methodist Church of this city, has applied at this office for assistance to complete the school building that his society have partially erected on the grounds that belongs to his church. I have visited the building and find it to be raised, weatherboarded, shingled, and partly floored. It is 25 by 35 feet inside measurement and is well situated for a school. The church desires this to be a self-sustaining school for the children of the members of the church. receiving pay from all who are able and free and those who are not, and they propose to pay their own teacher and bear all of the expenses of the school after they get started. It is estimated that it will cost $250 or $300 to finish the building and fit the room with benches, tables, etc. The church appears to wish to make this school independent of all aid outside of the church. Mr. Bradwell saw General Howard personally when he was in the city, and the general sent him to me. The general also remarked to me that when this matter was brought to my notice, I should say that he considered it favorably. Ultimately, the church's request was rejected by the Georgia Superintendent of Education. That's what we have here. It says, respectfully return to the Assistant Commissioner, District of Georgia, disapproved for the following reasons. First, Augusta is already fully supplied with schoolhouses. Second, it is not desirable to establish independent parish schools, but rather a general school system. And with that last part where he's mentioning, the Freedmen's Bureau desire to establish a general school system, Freedmen's Bureau can also be credited with basically establishing the public education system throughout most of the South. While the Assistant Commissioner desires to favor to the utmost all self-supporting schools, it is impossible from limited funds at his command to expend further sums in school building at Augusta, especially as there are already ample schoolrooms for all the children in that city. In some one of the buildings, most convenient ample room may be assigned to the school, and which this Bureau will be very glad to have supported exclusively by that church, and so forth. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau efforts in establishing schools is going to be very contentious. It's going to be resisted by many of the former Confederates in these states. And some of the Mississippi records, and most of the records I have are based on requests from researchers. So for instance, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, I got an inquiry from a researcher who, through the oral history within his family, he knew something about someone who was lynched or killed in Texas. And he wanted to know whether or not we had any information on that. We don't have the manpower as far as time and so forth to do research for individuals, but in any of my spare time, I decided to look into the field offices that had jurisdiction over that particular county. And although I didn't find anything relating to what he was talking about, I did find, similar information. Okay, but in this case, in Mississippi, the assistant commissioner for that particular state wrote, or the sub-assistant commissioner wrote this report to the assistant commissioner for the particular state. He says, it is an extremely unfortunate affair, but what else could have been expected when the local pulpit and press have been directing their energies against the school and teachers, basically saying that, in that particular area of Mississippi, even the preachers and the local press were, speaking out against educating, the formerly enslaved. If the pulpit thunders its anathema at teachers with impunity, and overt insult are heaped upon those who have taken their lives in their hands and are working day and night for the education of the black race. If I say these things are permitted, what other result could have been expected than the destruction of the school building? Everything seemed to be working smoothly. The planners, in several instances at the suggestion of the officers of the Bureau, seemed willing to have schools located on their farms. In fact, the prospect was better than that of last year, but now all seems gloomy. And the loss of this building, which was the mecca of the blacks in this vicinity, is one they will not soon forget. Okay. Along with education and labor contracts, some of the most valuable records in the Freedmen's Bureau are marriage records. Okay. Marriage records can vary depending on the particular field office or the particular state. For the Freedmen's Bureau records, or the Freedmen's Bureau in general, there often was no standard type of, there was no standard form of operation, meaning that each assistant commissioner of a particular state could kind of establish his own type of policy or establish his own emphasis on, whichever matters he wanted to focus on. So marriage records can vary from state to state. Many of the marriage records here in D.C., you can find actual marriage certificates that have been given, where you have the husband's name, first and surname, and the wife's first and maiden surname. Other times you have registers such as this, where you have, the names of each person listed. In this particular column, you have the name of the male, the male's residence, and in the third column, you have the name of the female or the wife, along with her maiden name. And it gives that information along with their ages at that time. Okay. Here's another marriage register from Mississippi. It gives some of the same information. It gives the name of the male, name of the female, dates, places of birth, and so forth. And it's given a date when their marriages are being legalized. Again, the Freedmen's Bureau was the institution, the primary institution that was legalizing or recognizing these marriages. Sometimes it may have been individuals who were coming there at that particular time to get married. But many of these records document, the marriages of individuals who considered themselves to be man and wife for decades. Some of the records you find, information where, the couple state that, they considered themselves to have been married for 50 years, or sometimes 60, I've seen 60 years and more sometimes. And they state where they were married under slavery. They give, the name of the owner at the time and other information. But, they're now finally getting their marriages, formally recognized, because under slavery, even though, sometimes the plantation owner would, allow them to jump the broom and consider themselves married, there was no legal recognition of marriage under slavery. So oftentimes, if it came down to it, individuals who considered themselves married could be sold apart from each other, which was something that happened often. Okay. So after this period, many of them are eager to have their marriages, formally recognized for the first time. And here's just another register of marriages, just showing some of the how they look and how they may differ from state to state. Okay. Here's another form from Arkansas, Yale County, Arkansas, where, in contrast to the more organized type of register with the columns that I showed you before, here's one where marriage certificates are just being written consecutively after each other with, the names of the individuals and so forth. So there are various ones. There are various types of marriage records that you can find. Complaints and outrages. These complaints and outrages pertain to acts of violence, crimes, and other incidents that occurred within many of these states. And the agents of the Freedmen's Bureau are going to be the only law enforcement type of agency existing at the time. So complaints will be taken to the agents after incidents occurred. Okay. So here are some examples that I came across. And you can find records such as this throughout the Freedmen's Bureau records. A lot of mine are from Georgia, because I was researching a certain area of Georgia, trying to find some of my own ancestry. And this is information that I just happened to come across randomly. Okay, so here we have an Amy and Nancy Wooden run out of a county in Georgia. Before me came in person Amy Wooden, colored, and her daughter Nancy Wooden. They say that in the year 1866, they worked for one Willis Wooden of the county of Wilkes in the state of Georgia for $50 a year for both of them, and they lived and worked with him 10 and a half months. That he is justly in debt to them at $45, and that they were run off by bushwhackers in the latter part of 1866, and that they have never received a cent for their services yet. They state that they were run out of Wilkes County, Georgia by certain lawless characters. Amy Wooden is a woman of 65 years old and in great destitution. Okay. Here's a complaint from a John and Amanda Little. Personally appeared John Little, colored, who states that he's employed by Kilpatrick and Leitner on their plantation in Columbia County, Georgia, under an agreement to work for the year 1868 for $65, and his rations that his wife Amanda was employed at $30 per year along with rations. But that sometime in March last, Mr. Cooper, the overseer in Kilpatrick and Leitner place, disagreed with Amanda and discharged her, but she has since remained with her husband upon the place. Up to the time of her discharge, rations were furnished her. John has continued to work up to the present time, and rations have been furnished him up to last Wednesday, the 12th of August. But on Monday, the 10th of August, his wife, Amanda, and Mr. Cooper's wife got into a quarrel, and Mr. Cooper beat and choked Amanda. On Wednesday, when John went to draw his rations, Mr. Cooper told John he would have to send Amanda off and refused to issue rations to him until his wife went away. Amanda is pregnant and about to be confined, and John cannot send her away without going himself, which he believed his employers are trying to force him to do in order to get his labor for nothing. John further states that he applied to Judge Shields, county judge of Columbia County, Georgia, for redress, and that Judge Shields told him, "Oh, well, you needn't come here. You all voted and throw me out of office, and I ain't authorized to do anything for you. And man, the man you have put in my place has not come yet, and I don't suppose he will ever come." Another complaint, Edwin and Margaret Bell. Freedman Edmund Bell makes complaint at this office that you have in your custody his sister Margaret Bell, and he is anxious to have said Margaret under his charge and protection. Has called on you for said Margaret, and that you have refused to give her up. Edmund Bell, being the nearest relative living to said Margaret, can claim the guardianship of Margaret according to law. You are hereby directed to give up said Margaret to said Edmund on receipt of this letter. Polly Reeves seeks custody of her daughter Mary. Polly Reeves, a freed woman, complains that Mr. Anthony, living near the Tennessee line, 5 or 6 miles from LaGrange, Tennessee, but in your county, holds her child in custody contrary to the wishes of the mother, Polly. The woman states that when she demanded the child, Mr. Woodson, father of Mrs. Anthony, drew a pistol and threatened to blow her brains out, but was prevented by a Mr. Walls, a magistrate living in that vicinity. This case was laid before me by General Wood. Now, here's some complaints from Ben Freedman's court, just highlighting that the complaints weren't always between, the formerly enslaved and the whites that they're now contracted to labor for. The Freedmen's Bureau also had to solve disputes between blacks themselves in certain areas. Basic things that, law enforcement would deal with today, like domestic violence and other types of situations. Some of the cases from this particular register, William Spencer has been accused by his wife, Catherine Spencer, of assault and battery with the intention of killing her, and he's a man of dangerous character. In the testimony of the witnesses, it has been proved that the said William Spencer has attempted to kill his wife, and he is a man of a dangerous character. The decision of the court is that he leave the Bend or go 6 months in a blockhouse. Another one, James and Mary have been arrested and brought before the court for disturbing the peace. The decision of the court is that each party will pay a fine of $2.50 or have 5 days in the blockhouse. Mr. Henry Johnson is accused of assault and battery by Cecilia Robertson on her person. So a lot of basic issues of, domestic violence and so forth that Freedmen's Bureau had to deal with. Okay. Here's a Mississippi Sub-Commissioner report. Many of these reports contain a lot of real good information that can give you an idea of what was occurring in some of the, the tense atmosphere that existed in many of these areas. It gives you, some insight into, if you're a descendant of any of these individuals, it gives you some insight into what they had to deal with. Many of these letters are much too long for me to go over right now, but I printed some of them out so that you can, if you're interested in this from a historical or genealogical basis, you can just read through them. But in this particular report, it talks about the efforts of this particular office, the trouble they were having in, establishing contracts between free people and some of the landowners. They were trying to establish contracts where the freedmen would go and work as farm laborers for wages. But for a long time, as I mentioned earlier, many of the free people resisted this, and they feared to, sign any type of contract because they feared that, these contracts would be just another form of slavery. So again, highlighting that desire for land that, you find expressed consistently through many of these records. This particular sub-commissioner, points that out, saying that basically showing that the reason many of them were resisting is because they desired land. Many of them evinced an anxiety to secure land. They wish to become independent farmers or on their own hook, as they say. I guess that's a phrase that many of them use to, that indicate that they wanted to be autonomous, or they called it on their own hook. Okay. But for the most part, all of them eventually, very few of them ever got any land. And after a while, they had to, go into some of these labor contracts. Here's, an example of a labor contract. This is one from Arkansas. These first part up here gives the terms of the contract. Then it names all of the individuals who are going to be bound by this particular contract. So all of these individuals listed, it provides their names. This particular one gives the time period. In the far column, it gives each person's age. So all of the named persons will be bound by this particular work contract or labor contract. Now, in some of these contracts, you can find documentation on some of the early instances of mass migration that was occurring during this period. Here's a labor for example, during the Reconstruction period, some of the older southern states, especially places like in the Deep South, states such as Georgia and South Carolina, sometimes they're going to find that they have enough labor, they have sufficient labor. Therefore, the wages that are being offered to the freed people are not as competitive with some of the wages that are being offered in some of what at that time was some of the newer southern states, what was called the Old Southwest, states such as, the Mississippi Delta, Arkansas, parts of Louisiana, Texas, and so forth. Many of these states still had a, high demand for labor, because there was still, even though it was no longer slavery, there was still the cultivation of cotton. So they still needed labor. So some of the agent and Freedmen's Bureau agents in Georgia in particular will often facilitate travel from Georgia to places such as Arkansas, where some of these persons were in more high demand. Okay. And here's just another example of contract laborers going from Georgia. The first one was from Georgia to Arkansas. This one is same contract laborers going from Georgia to Mississippi. Okay. And this type of migration is something that I wasn't aware of, but I did there's a presentation that I've done earlier on the Kansas Exodus, which I assume was the first voluntary mass migration of African Americans. But since then, I found that the first voluntary mass migration actually precedes the Kansas Exodus. Before that, there was an intra-South or migration within the South, where African Americans in some states, such as Georgia or South Carolina, were migrating to the old Southwest states of Mississippi, Arkansas, and other places where they thought they could. Some were going there because they had the idea that they could get land. They would be more successful in getting their own land in those places. But later it would be from the idea that they would get better wages. Okay. Describing one of these migrations from Edgefield, South Carolina to Arkansas, one particular historian says, the black pioneers who left Edgefield for the settled swamps, piney woods, and uplands of Arkansas contributed to a much larger stream of African-American movement to the frontiers of the New South after the Civil War. The first voluntary mass migration, which was the first voluntary mass migration of African-Americans. Between 1870 and 1910, roughly 1 in every 10 black Southerners migrated to another state in the South. 3/4 of these migrants headed farther south and west, most to the old Southwest states of Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, and to the Mississippi Delta. Demographer William Vickery calculated that nearly 700,000 African Americans moved to these 5 states between 1870 and 1910. This southwestern expansion would have its greatest impact on Arkansas. Okay. So this migration can be documented in some of these Freedmen's Bureau records, along with some of the Freedman's Bank records. But not just the voluntary migration, you can get evidence of the last day or evidence of the legacy of the internal domestic slave trade also. You can get a lot of that evidence from these records. So, and I'll give examples of some of these instances, okay? Okay, but before I get to that, here's, again, the desire to get land. Here's dealing with land. Here's the record that I found where J.A. Davis, a white citizen of Arkansas, gave land to a colored woman. J.A. Davis of the county of the state aforesaid, in consideration of the valuable service rendered by Farraby Davis, a colored woman of the county and state aforesaid, do hereby give on to live the said Farraby a life estate in the following described tract of land, to wit, the southwest quarter of the northeast quarter of section 23 in the township south, containing 80 acres, to have and to hold the same during the natural life, not to be traded or sold by her, nor any of her representatives, and at the death of the said Farraby, the said lands to revert back to my heirs. Now, it doesn't give any reason or any information on why J.A. Davis decided to give this land to Farraby Davis, the colored woman, but if you're a descendant of Farraby Davis, you could do more research. It could have been, they have the same surname. It could be a situation where they're actually biologically related, which is, something that was, common during the time. Or, it could be other reasons. Only through more research, would a potential descendant of either of these individuals determine, what, the relationship was between J.A. and Farabee that inspire him to, voluntarily give her land. Okay, now, registers of applications for transportation. With these, you can find information on individuals who have been separated from family members, oftentimes during slavery, who are now attempting to rejoin family members. Sometimes the individuals are seeking transportation to get back to their native state where they may have been sold from. Other times they're requesting resources to have, loved ones sent to them where they are. Okay. Yep, sorry. In this particular instance, we have Barry Pillman, who requests transport to get his 3 daughters, Molly, Susan, and Maria, from Mississippi back to Augusta, Georgia. Okay. And he says, I am desirous in bringing from Mississippi my 3 children, all minors, who are now without protection and support, being twice notified of their condition and warned that I must come for them or they will be bound out for a term of years or set adrift in the world. I have made every exertion to accumulate the means to travel upon, but am still unable to go unless you can afford me assistance. My family here consists of a wife and 2 children who are provided for during my absence. And if you can obtain for me transportation to Mississippi, I will be enabled to afford that protection and support due from a parent to his children. Very respectfully, Barry Pillman. Okay. So to me, since the children are separated from the parents, this seems to me to be a situation in which the children may have been sold or separated during a period of slavery. Okay. Here's one. There's a free woman's daughter who was sold, and she is explicitly stated in her letter that her daughter was sold from Georgia to Galveston, Texas during slavery. Nellie Carmichael, free woman, states that her daughter, Alice Hurd, was sold from the city before emancipation to Galveston, Texas, where she now is in a destitute condition. She can be found in Galveston by addressing her through the post office. I would recommend that as her mother is in comfortable circumstances and able to support her transportation enabled to support her, that transportation be given to her to this city by the proper authorities in Galveston. Okay. Here's transportation of a free boy from Augusta, Georgia to Richmond, Virginia. I have the honor to request transportation from this city to Richmond, Virginia for free boy Samuel Smith. This boy has been transported thus far from Augusta, Georgia. He desires to be sent to his parents. This will relieve the government from his support. Again, these are instances oftentimes where, children have been sold away from family members, spouses have been sold away during slavery, and now during the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, if they were able to maintain contact with, their relatives, or they knew where their relatives were, they were trying to rejoin them, and so forth. Okay. Transport of small colored girl from South Carolina to Virginia. I have the honor to request that transportation be furnished from this city for one small girl, colored, to Orange Courthouse, Virginia. She is in this city in destitute circumstances and no friends to assist her in getting to her parents. I think this is an urgent case. Here's a letter, a transport of old free woman from Millersville, Georgia to Charleston, South Carolina. The bearer of this, a free woman, Lativa Clements, is old and infirm and destitute. She has relatives and children in Charleston, South Carolina, to whom she desires to go. If it is possible to give her transportation, it will be an act of great kindness to a worthy, though unfortunate, person. And within that same file, there was a letter from Miss Lativa Clements' daughter, okay, where let me see, where her daughter is basically, I guess the daughter was notified that her mother could potentially be returned, and within the Freedmen's Bureau of Records, the letter from the daughter was included. It says, "Dear mother, it is with much pleasure that I sit down to write you these few letters, hoping that they will find you well as they leaves me at present. Dear mother, I would have written you before, but I did not know how to direct your letter. I was more than glad to hear from you and glad to hear that you is well. You must be in good cheer until we send for you. I expect to get a free transportation from General Scott to come for you, but if I do not get it, I will send for you. They says that they would like much to see you. Harry Matthews expects to get a free transportation to go for his family, and I think I will get one at the same time. But the general is not here at present. He is going to Savannah to see about some business. But I will see him as soon as he comes. Dear mother, when you write, you can direct your letter to Mrs. Cecilia Gibbs, for I do not know anyone else that you could direct to. Write soon, for I am longing to hear from you. I hope that I will see you before long, for I am very anxious to see you. If God spares my life, I hope that we will meet once again before we die. I have no more to say at this time. I remain your daughter, Sophie Brown." Okay. And another one, this will be handed to you, another transportation record. This will be handed to you by a freedman who is one of a party of 5 who have been furnished with transportation from Atlanta to Augusta, as you will see endorsed upon the enclosed communication. They are desirous of reaching their sons and daughters living near New Bern, North Carolina, where they can be properly provided for. And to that end, it is necessary that the Assistant Commissioner of South Carolina furnish them with transportation to such point en route to New Bern as they may have the power to grant, and if he may deem it, practicable to do so. Carolyn Thomas has applied at this office for transportation from Augusta, Georgia to Montgomery, Alabama, where she states she has a husband who is willing and able to provide for her. She states that she will become a burden upon public charity if she is not sent to her husband. Her husband's name is Josephus Thomas, and is supposed to be living with S.H. Grant at Montgomery, Alabama, at the West Point and Montgomery Depot. Her husband is a carpenter. I would respectfully recommend that transportation be furnished in this case if upon inquiry it be found that her husband is able and willing to provide for her. Free boy Frank Williams in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, states that his parents died here since emancipation. He has brothers and sisters live with a Mr. William Sharp 1 mile from Baton Rouge. Recommends that transportation be furnished if it is ascertained his relatives will provide for him. Okay. And most of the other ones are just more transportation records, indicating individuals trying to rejoin family members that they, in all likelihood, they were separated from by cells during slavery. And this is an example of a transportation register. This is one from South Carolina. Within these transportation registers, you can find evidence of both, types of historical migration experiences. You can find records that clearly seem to indicate that, individuals are trying to get transportation to states where they may have been sold. And to rejoin family members. But there are other instances where individuals are leaving states and seeking to go to some of those formerly Southwest Southern states for transportation. Most of the ones that include individuals trying to get to native states from which they were sold, those usually consists of single individuals or just a few individuals. The travel registers that indicate individuals are trying to get to, states such as Mississippi, Arkansas, and so forth, oftentimes those include multiple individuals. For instance, this one on line 7, you have no names given, just 35 adults, 14 children seeking transportation from Columbia, South Carolina to Grenada, Mississippi, 49 persons in all. Line 8, Adam Pulley and 56 others seeking transportation from Columbia, South Carolina to Vicksburg, Mississippi, 57 persons in all. Okay. And, with these records, if you're a descendant of someone, and oftentimes, because of, cell migration and so forth, when you're doing your genealogical research as a descendant of such individuals, oftentimes you're going to have to go from state to state. That's something that I've come across in my own genealogy, where when I began mine in the brief moments that I have to try to do it, I went to my mother's side, the Georgia side of the family, and I assumed that side of my family had always been in Georgia. I just assumed because I had never heard anything different. But once I began my genealogical research, when I came here to the National Archives, going into the oldest census records, the oldest census records indicated that my the paternal fathers of both my great-great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather were both born in Virginia. So they would have been alive during the period of slavery, and just based on history, I just assume, and it seems likely to me that, they were part of that, that mass sale from the older tobacco-based states of, the Chesapeake area, initially down to Georgia and places such as that, but then later out to Virginia. When you go to the Freedmen's Bank records, you find a lot of evidence of that. You can go on Ancestry, and I play around with it sometime where you can just go to the state and type in the option for place of birth and place where live. And for example, if you go to Mississippi or Louisiana, places like that, and type in Virginia for place of birth, just a large amount of names come up, just indicating that cell from states such as Virginia. Also find a lot from, the state of Maryland. I was going for the Freedmen's Bank presentation last week. I showed some examples that I found of that, multiple people through the rolls where you look at Virginia and states such as Mississippi, Louisiana, where, just Eastern Shore of Maryland, persons based, sometimes Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., Fredericksburg, Virginia, Richmond, Petersburg, other places throughout this area, just, showing some of that forced migration that occurred during the last decades of slavery. So this is just a brief introduction to some of the records that we have. There are many records beyond this. We need more individuals researching because at this time, the information that we get from these records is just going to be based on research. Since they're so voluminous, there's no way these records can be, really mined for information other than that. Are there any questions?
I'd like to start.
Okay.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. I can see that this is an amazing topic, and we could probably stay and listen to you for quite a while. The question I was thinking about was those Freedmen Bureau agents went through an amazing experience, and the things that happened to these people are just unbelievable. My question is, do you know of any books or articles that were actually written by the Freedmen's Bureau agents?
There's an autobiography. Oliver Otis Howard, I hope I'm not getting this. General Howard, he has an autobiography. There are other books related to Freedmen's Bureau activity, where agents gave some of their information. offhand, I can't think of the titles of those books. I can provide information on them, but definitely Otis Howard has his own autobiography that goes into detail as he was the commissioner, the head of the Freedmen's Bureau for many of these years. But there are also other books that include a lot of information on the Freedmen's Bureau, but oftentimes they're addressing the history of Reconstruction in general. But the Freedmen's Bureau was just a major part of Reconstruction, so there's no way any history of Reconstruction, can, neglect the activities of the Freedmen's Bureau. But there are books, if we're able to, when the full letters that I transcribe, I can include a bibliography that you can put online for, researchers who are interested in, secondary resources or reference sources. Okay.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
If further questions, if you could queue up to the aisle microphones, because we're broadcasting live and capturing this on video recording so that you can watch this in the future. We ask that you use the microphones in the aisles. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for a very informative and interesting talk. Do the records show what happened to these people or to their requests or their complaints?
For the transportation records?
Well, not just the transportation, but any of the complaints too. I know you've read to us the issues, the problems people were having. Are the resolutions in the records?
Not necessarily. Sometimes you get some type of resolution to whatever the situation may have been, but it's not the case in every instance. Remember, the Freedmen's Bureau, it's the years of its major activity was only from its founding in 1865 to about 1868. So that's a very brief period of time.
That's
Even though it formally dissolved in 1872, but really between 1865 to 1868 is where you're going to find the most information. So that's just not enough time for some of these cases to be resolved.
Oh, so some of those transportation issues might not have been taken care of within the 3 years, for example.
Well, again, with the transportation, remember the Freedmen's Bureau was extremely undermanned. It was understaffed and underfinanced. So the records that survive are just basic correspondence, where when the particular cases first arrive, they're writing sub-assistant commissioner is writing the commissioner, notifying him that he has this particular case. He recommends that funding be given for transportation and so forth. So we can assume that it was done, but the surviving records aren't necessarily going to document it. Because it's back in the 19th century, before computers,
Yeah, right.
before some of the modern record-keeping type systems, and
Okay.
what we have is what we have.
Right.
I assume, though, that in cases where the agent agreed or supported the request, that it was a case where they felt, I assume that in those cases, if it was transportation funds, the transportation was provided. Mm-hmm. They tried to do what they could do, but throughout these records, you're going to see a lot of cases where the agents honestly state that in a lot of instances, there's nothing they could do. Basically, the only places where they had some real, power or effect were in the towns and the immediate vicinity around the towns. But the further you got away from the local field office, when you got further out into, further rural areas, many of them just honestly stated that there was nothing they could do about outrages happening and violence. And, I think in some of the letters that I transcribed, we had one agent in, I think, Mississippi, where he was saying that in some parts of that state, it was as if some of them were still, worse than slavery, because during slavery, at least, a slave was an investment.
Yeah.
And so the owner would at least attempt to feed them and clothe them and keep them alive. But in these cases where they, from that particular agent's perspective, it was almost worse than slavery in that they were still held and being beaten and everything, but oftentimes they weren't even adequately being fed. So, but that agent said there was nothing he could really do. He was requesting troops. He was requesting like mounted men to go to some of these areas and so they could enforce the law.
Yeah.
Juan was saying that when the troops were removed, he could predict that it's going to be, hopeless in many of these rural areas. So.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay.
How much of the records have actually been transcribed or typed on the computer so we can read them better?
Oh, very, very few. There are some, and it's something that's in, it's in constant progress. But these records are so voluminous. There's so many of them that it would take. The last I heard, and don't quote me on this because I'm not sure. I need to find out myself. I heard something at one point that the Smithsonian's African American Museum was going to try to digitize and index a lot of these records, but it's not the case as of yet, and I don't know any type of time frame or schedule that they have for that. A lot of these records that I transcribe is my first time reading them and seeing them anywhere. Meaning, no one they're free. For scholars, for historians, or whoever, people, a lot of these records are still, uncharted territory. Meaning, you can still find information in these records that, as of yet, hasn't appeared in any type of reference source or any secondary source.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So, and another couple of questions. Are the records you talked about, are they basically here in this building?
Yes, they're here in this building. As researchers, you're not going to have access to the actual textual records themselves, but we have them on microfilm. So that makes it easier. We have them on microfilm in the microfilm room. And the way you would go about it is we have what we call descriptive pamphlets that describe the contents of the microfilm. What you'll do is, for instance, if you had ancestors in, say, I'm just using this as an example,
Meriwether
Halifax
County, Georgia.
North Carolina. Where?
Meriwether County, Georgia.
Okay, Meriwether County, Georgia. What you'll do is go through the descriptive pamphlet, see which field office had jurisdiction over Meriwether County, get the rolls for that particular field office, and then just scroll through the rolls and hope you find something on your ancestor. But it's really very tedious, time-consuming research at this point.
Okay. And one last question. Mm-hmm. You were at the end. You were talking about the migration from Virginia to the South.
Yes.
When I was doing research on my, great-grandfather who was a slave in Georgia, most of the census documents say he was born in Georgia. And I saw this one that said he was born in Virginia. And it was very distinctive, and it wasn't a typo and all that stuff. So I'm wondering if he might have been a part of that.
Yeah, if it were me, I would assume that the Virginia statement is correct because because that's the Virginia statement is an outlier. So why would that exist? Why would that be stated? Because in census records, it's common for some of the information to be inaccurate.
Correct. Because
you have someone who's writing the information down. Sometimes they'll just assume, or they'll just fill in the information assuming that the person was born in the state where the census is being taken, or if the person wasn't home at the time that the census is being taken. Sometimes in the early years, the census enumerator will ask someone else. Sometimes a child or a younger person wouldn't necessarily know where an older person was born. So they would give incorrect information. Because I've seen in some of my own research, I've seen that type of situation where on one record it says a person is born in one state, in another record it says a different state. But through further research, you can determine which is accurate. But if Virginia is given, since that's an outlier, an outlier in the question, I would assume that that's a major clue that you should try to pursue. And, I would take it that is a good chance that that's the correct statement.
Okay.
And it's something that was very common.
Okay, I'll let somebody else go. I got 1,000 questions, but I'll let somebody. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis, for your report. I have the people that were sent after slavery were sent to Brazil. Were they sold back into slavery?
That's a real good thing. That's something that I came across and just randomly while I was going through the microfilm. It was actually in response to the researcher from Texas who called on the telephone. I spoke with him over the phone, and he was seeking information regarding Marshall County, Texas. So I was just scrolling through the microfilm to see what information I could find that would potentially relate to what he was talking about. And I came across this whole thing about the Brazil scheme. I had never heard of it before, and I just haven't had the time to do any research into it, but it was something very interesting. But the Marshall, Texas Sub Assistant Commissioner report from April 20th, 1867, he says, I went to investigate as far as possible the Brazilian immigration at Starrville, Smith County. I found one Parson Starr who knew something of the scheme, told me 1,000 freedmen had been taken to Brazil from Texas, having been hired as boat hands, and while nearing New Orleans, they would be sent below and there remain until night. They would be taken off by some vessel bound for Brazil. I could not obtain names of persons connected. Presumed they might be where he cited before a proper grand jury. So he's saying that the witness that he spoke with, he's assuming that if this person was called to testify before a grand jury, he would provide the names of these individuals who he's claiming were sold to Brazil. Right. But you remember, Brazil was the last. Brazil slavery lasted until into the 1880s, I think. So it continued after slavery was, abolished here. So I don't know the accuracy. I don't know how truthful this is, but it's very interesting that, that would be something major if after the Civil War and after slavery here, freedmen were being deceived and sold or sent to Brazil, Okay. So, but this is all I found. I didn't find anything beyond this in the records.
Thank you for that bit of research. The other questions are one is there were groups of people that requested transportation from somewhere in the South to somewhere, like 35, 40 people at a time as a group. Was there any particular reason for them migrating as a group like this?
Oh, of course. Well, in the Edgefield situation, and just reading some of the history of that, in Edgefield, South Carolina experienced like severe violence during what they called the Redemption, during when the period after the Civil War, when many of the former Confederates, began to take over the government. Take over, the governments throughout the local areas in the South. But basically what they engaged in, for all intents and purposes, was a campaign of terror. It was terrorism where, they basically terrorized, many of the, African American population out of political participation. And Edgefield, South Carolina was somewhere where that was like notoriously, severe. Okay. And with them, they basically just got together and, they identified Arkansas as a place where they could potentially get land, or if not get land, they could get better wages, but they just identified Arkansas as a place they could go. They just knew that, but regardless of where they wanted to get out of Edgefield. Now, in other circumstances, it was just a situation where you had individuals who all lived together, they knew each other, they may have been related to each other, they may have been people originally from the same plantation during slavery. Now, after slavery, they want to go somewhere, they're looking for a better opportunity.
Right.
And most of the time, most of these migrants, these voluntary migrants, are from the states of Georgia and South Carolina, probably North Carolina from a lesser extent. But most of them I've seen are from Georgia and South Carolina, and they're going out towards, certain areas of Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and so forth.
Right.
Even one of the persons in the Freedmen's Bank that I did in another presentation is Henry Adams, who was involved in the Exoduster movement. He was born in Georgia, but he grew up in Louisiana, and I assume he was part of that migration. I haven't been in his testimony. I wasn't able to find anything indicating that he was sold out there. I think if I recall correctly, he was part of a migration from Georgia out to
But this was
Louisiana and Texas.
This was their own movement when
Yeah,
they called
their
it the
own
Exodus movement. They just collected themselves in groups and decided to go, chose a leader and decided to go somewhere.
Yes. So in general, it's going to be a voluntary migration from places such as Georgia and South Carolina to these other places.
Okay.
Now, for the most part, if you see individuals who were born in Virginia or Maryland who are now in, say, Mississippi or Texas or Louisiana, they're often older, and they were individuals who were more likely sold. They were sold from the Chesapeake region when tobacco was no longer a profitable cash crop.
Okay.
And demand for labor was much, more needed, or much more in demand. Labor was in much more demand in the expanding cotton belt. Many of them were initially sold down to Georgia, then to Alabama, and then towards the end of slavery, they were being sold out to Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and so forth.
Okay.
So that was still in operation at the end of slavery. Those same states, now they're no longer individuals who are being sold there, but they still had a great demand for labor in a new type of system that was being established. So the Georgians and the South Carolinians mainly took advantage of, or tried to take advantage of, opportunities in those states. They assumed that they would get better wages or they would get land more easily out there than in Georgia and South Carolina.
Thank you. And one other question. When you started, you said this was, March 3rd was the 150th anniversary of the Freedmen's Bank and the 150th anniversary of the Freedmen's Bureau. Yes. So did they start separately and simultaneously?
They are completely separate institutions. They are not directly related to each other, but they were trying to address some of the same issues, but from a different vantage point. Okay. But the Freedmen's Bureau was its own thing. The Freedmen's Bureau came forth out of the Union Army. It was part of the War Department. So during, the Civil War and aftermath, the Union troops were they were tasked with dealing with contraband, trying to feed some of these people. Some were trying to figure out what to do with abandoned lands. Some felt that, these free people should be settled on these abandoned lands. That's where the William Tecumseh Sherman thing came. So they were dealing with the free people already. So the Freedmen's Bureau was just a more organized continuation of that. It was still it still fell under the jurisdiction of, the War Department. It was just more organized and consolidated. The Freedmen's Bank was a completely separate thing, although related. Freedmen's Bank was founded by a person, a minister named John W. Alford. he served as a chaplain with William Tecumseh Sherman's troops. So he accompanied Sherman's troops through Sherman's march through Georgia. And during his time, as the chaplain, he observed and witnessed some of the, conditions. And Alfred also served in the Freedmen. He also was the Freedmen's Bureau educational agent. But from a financial perspective, he felt initially for the U.S. colored troops, he felt that they needed some, they needed a major institution where they could deposit their money so they wouldn't be, swindled out of their money or lose their money, because these are individuals who had just recently been enslaved. They had never made wages. They had never handled money before. So he envisioned the Freedmen's Bank as being an institution that would provide a service, provide financial services where they could make deposits and save their money, but also teach them, I guess financial literacy is what we would call it today, how, thrift and the habit of saving money and accumulating savings that you can then use to purchase a home or get land and so forth. But, so all of these were, the ideals behind the Freedmen's Bank and the Freedmen's Bureau were percolating, already prior to the end of the war. And many of the individuals involved with both, many of the individuals were sometimes involved in both, but they were still separate institutions. All of them came before Lincoln, or went through Congress and came before Lincoln at the same time. He signed acts legitimizing these institutions at the same time. But from a legal perspective, the Freedmen's Bureau was an official arm of the federal government since it was part of the War Department. The Freedmen's Bank was a company that was, it was incorporated. It was given permission. It was incorporated and given the sanction by Congress, but Congress didn't provide any federal jurisdiction over. There was no official federal jurisdiction over the Freedmen's Bank, meaning the federal government wasn't responsible for the solvency of the Freedmen's Bank. The Freedmen's Bank was more of officially a private company, a private institution, even though it was kind of affiliated or operating under the auspices of the federal government. It wasn't officially a federal institution, is it?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing your encyclopedic knowledge. And thank you for joining us online. And I wanted to state again that all of the presentation materials that we have here in person are also going to be available on our webpage, www.archives.gov, calendar, Know Your Records. So I hope that you'll go back to that webpage and download the handouts, and the additional material that Mr. Davis provided will be up by the end of next week. And we hope to see you again. Thank you so much. Thank you.